Yeah, yeah. Let me take care of something real quick before I jump on and do this. 1 second. Just gotta bring something up. Yeah, I probably don't need it right now. Okay, sorry. Okay. All right, here we are once again. So, a while ago, I did a tank and healer tier list. I did a melee DPS tier list. I didn't get around to doing a range DPS tier list. And for the most part, they're all pretty good. I know I did a terrible disservice to Warrior, so I'm here to correct those things. And I'll be straight up honest with you guys. It was my mistake with the Arms Warrior. I was more so using information that I felt was correct based off of like 4.0, 4.1 stuff. And that's wrong. That's 1,000% wrong. I never took the stream down, never took the video down because I wanted to see the comments and I wanted to get the feedback and just do better on it. So here I am today, and I wanted to get the range DPS out the way. I never actually did a range DPS video, so definitely want to get that out the way. But I'm here back once again, and some of the stuff might be a little rehashed, but now we're using a lot more information. I've actually played, I don't know if I can actually say this on YouTube, but I played other versions of Cataclysm, we'll say, and got some decent feedback from people, right? Like the ins and outs, what speed runners are doing, what just the casual people are doing, and I was able to culminate that into some notes I have on my side here. But also looking at the changes that were made while Kata was actually, going while it was live, and maybe some things that Blizzard may fall back on in the future. Who knows? Like we've seen a little bit of changes with Wrath stuff, right? We didn't get the exact Wrath that we got in 2008, and I think for the most part, the changes that they did in Wrath was pretty okay. There some of the glyph changes that like Feral and Red Paladins got. The item level changes in Old War, like some of those things I think worked out for the betterment of the game. I don't think any of those things were a detriment. So hopefully we get some more of that stuff in Cataclysm. But I will say this, in regards to this tier list and Cata, I'm gonna be not only weighing this not just on DPS, because that's, good damage is great, but the thing about Cataclysm, and this kind of followed its trend into MOP, Cata had really, really good balancing between their classes. There wasn't a super huge disparity between the top damaging spec and, well, there was a huge disparity, but you get what I'm trying to say. Like the actual bottom viable spec, right? We're not talking about Frost Mages. I'm sorry, guys. But Cata was pretty decently balanced in both PvP and PvE, if I'm being honest, if I'm being real. And that trend kind of led to MOP. I still think to this day, even though Dragonflight's kind of close, I think MOP is probably, if not the best, one of the best balanced expansions for classes. I think MOP was really, really good. MOP was just ahead of its time. Just my opinion. You could hate me if you want, but I think that's my opinion. I think Dragonflight was pretty good. Like there are certain things. It's weird because MOP didn't have Mythic Plus and Dragonflight does, so you kind of have to look at that. Kind of got to separate them a little bit, but just in terms of looking at just rating, like even if you just exclude Mythic Plus, if you look at rating, I think MOP kind of takes the cake for overall class balance. And Kata wasn't bad either. Kata was pretty good. So I don't want to just say this class does great damage. It's S tier. Like for the most part, People aren't gonna just like people are gonna take you regardless. Like you probably heard me say this in my other Kata related videos, is that Kata kind of was the start, in my opinion, on a lot of homogenization that came about in WoW, and it was a lot by virtue of its buffs. Like a lot of buffs kind of got mashed together, and a lot of classes kind of brought the same thing. There were some classes, like, you know, few and far between, that brought unique stuff, but a lot of the buffs just kind of got melded into one. Like as an example, I think probably the most famous one, that Kings and Mark of the Wild are both the same buff. They're both the stat buff, right? Like that was the only time that Mark of the Wild was the stat buff. So Kings and Mark of the Wild, the stat buff. Blessing of Wisdom is gone. Now you get that mana, that MP5 effect from Blessing of Might, so it gives attack power and MP5. Like the spell power buff, right? Mages do, Arcane Intellect does 6% spell power, but then there are a couple classes that also do 6% and also do 10%. Like there's just a lot of just melding of buffs, and there's like very little unique buffs. Like in TBC, and even to a lesser extent in Wrath, there's a lot of unique buffs, right? Kata not so much, or debuffs I should say, buffs and debuffs. Kata not so much. So you're not really going to get brought because you bring this special thing, or you will, but only if you play like this one particular class or two particular classes. Like it's very few and far between with Cataclysm. So between balancing, between the homogenization of buffs and classes, I'm going to be really weighing based off of performances, one, definitely, to the respective role, right? To damage for DPSing, to healing for healers, and maybe a little bit of both for tanks and survivability. But I'm also going to put some stock into utility as well, probably a little bit more stock, because utility, like I said, is few and far between, and sometimes utility is the what is it? What's the word I'm looking for? The bridge to the gap of maybe helping a guild progress. So performance, utility, viability, all those things are going to get weighed. It's not just this class slaps, it's S tier. This class doesn't slap, it's not tier. So keep that in mind. Also, as you can see, I have all 31 specs. So we're doing melee DPS, we're doing range DPS, we're doing tanks, we're doing healers, we're doing the whole shebang. So take this walk with me. If you join in the middle or you join at the beginning and you watch it back, I appreciate you. If you catch this once this is posted up, I appreciate you. As always, you know, I love just giving out praise. You guys are great. But other than that, let's jump to it. So I think I have to just fix a mistake that I did before, and that's tiering the Arms Warrior. So I tiered Arms Warrior in, I think, like needs help or like C tier or something like that. Like C tier in my old one. And that was really because I was thinking about two things. Number one, my experience with Arms Warriors while I was playing Kata, which was very skewed because, again, the Kata we're going to start with is going to probably be the 4.32 patch, right? It's not going to be the 4.0 patch. So it's going to be a lot different than what I'm remembering. And number two, I didn't equate to all the buffs that Arms got and like how good Arms is. So ever since I got that feedback, and then I actually did my own research and talked to Warriors and stuff like that, I'm going to put Arms in what would be the S tier. I guess this is technically S plus, or is it S tier? Let me see. I have no cap as S tier. I think I have Platinum with no features is A, Sol is B, Pug Champs is C, Play With Friends is D, and then Cap is F tier. But Arms got to go up there. I've gotten too much feedback. I've done too much research now, and I've seen it. Arms has to be S tier. Now, there's a slight argument. I did talk to one warrior who was pretty like on the fence. He was by virtue, he was an Arms Warrior. Because we're getting the 4.32 patch, that was a patch that didn't really have too many crazy changes. Actually, it didn't really have any changes for Warrior, but in the 4.3 patch, I think Arms got like a nerf. Like their two-handed weapon specialization passive got nerfed down a little bit, but he seems to think that might affect not necessarily the class, but the actual performance that players will give, which I can understand. I can kind of see that, right? Because we're going to have better players than what we had 10, 11 years ago, right? Somebody's going to and now we're backed by a whole Discord community. Things are going to be different. So that nerf might be more impactful on the Warrior now because we have so many better players and so many different communities playing. So I could see the argument for arms not being S tier. Might drop down to A, but arms is still a pretty good spec, right? Another thing I do want to say before I continue is that I'm kind of trying to keep this in phase 1 confines, right? Because I think each phase is kind of different in their needs, right? Whereas like you start to see more reliance on burst damage in like phase 2 and 3, like Firelands and Dragon Soul. Yes, there's some mechanics that require high amounts of damage in a short time frame in phase 1. I think most notable is probably like the eggs in Sinestro, right? Like running up to the side pillars and DPSing the eggs. If you don't, it's a problem, right? Sinestro in itself is just a big DPS fight, but there are some damage checks, but I feel like those damage checks or those burst damage checks really get amplified the later you go into Cataclysm. So I'm gonna try to stick to the confines of phase 1, but I will talk about phase 2 and 3 because obviously if you're choosing a main, that means hopefully you're gonna main it from start to finish. So in phase 1, there are burst requirements, but not nearly as much as phase 2 and 3, in my opinion. I could be misremembering something, but like I said, I think the most notable ones is Sinestra, the eggs on Sinestra, the ads on Cho'Gall. I'm trying to think. I guess if you technically the bosses in Throne of the Four Winds, because they all have to die at separate times. That's not really burst damage, right? That's just more control damage, so maybe not. But there are certain burst mechanics, but I don't think there's as many in phase 1 as there are in the later phases of Kata. So, but arms, because of that slight nerf, I guess you can't even call it a slight nerf because it is a nerf. Because of the nerf and the better player pool that we're going to have, it might bump down arms to A tier, but as it stands, until we see that, arms I think is going to be an S tier. All right. Pardon me. Drink some water real quick. Okay. And you know what? I'm just going to go down the list here. We're just going to go in order. So did I mix these up? Oh, no. Oh, it mixed it up for me. All right, we'll be all right. Affliction. So, Affliction, I think... See, Affliction is never really super, super dominant in Kata, but it's never terrible, right? Affliction never... To me, it still has pretty good execute, but it never, like, becomes super, super great. But I think that's probably more so because it gets overshadowed by Demonology. And because, like, whenever you have a class, like, and this is more for the pure classes than the other specs, but whenever you have a class that kind of shares its utility with the other specs of the same class, it kind of gets muddied. But Affliction doesn't really have to worry about that because it doesn't bring Demonic Pact, and Demo does. But I think that might be why it kind of gets overshadowed a little bit. But I'm going to put I'm going to put Affliction in solid. I think Affliction is definitely serviceable. And I think you can definitely still do big numbers, especially in the execute phase, even though there's a lot of classes with good execute now. So, like, again, that kata balancing. So, keep that in mind. But I think I'm going to put Affliction in the solid tier. I think it just performs solidly, right? The tools that it gets is pretty decent, and it's not really affected by the 4.3 changes. There wasn't really anything super major in the 4.3 patch changes for Affliction. That's more for Destro, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I think Affliction is just solid. It's never really bad. I think it's a little bit better than Pug Champs, like, because you could carry a Pug. Like, if you're a solid Affliction Warlock, you could carry the Pugs. But it's kind of hard because Affliction is a range class that's kind of stationary, right? It doesn't really have the greatest burst damage, right? So it's hard to carry as an Affliction lock because it's a little bit different. But its damage profile is just a little bit different. Its target swapping is a little bit different. So it's like, it's a little weird, but Affliction I think is still pretty solid. Arcane. If you heard anything about Kata, you know Arcane is pretty phenomenal. I think Arcane goes into the Platinum No features. Arcane is a really, really solid spec, so much so that in 4.3 they buffed the hell out of Fire just to catch it up. And then they kind of nerfed Fire a little bit just to bring it down a little bit. But they buffed Fire because Arcane was so dominant and Fire wasn't really, really popping. Especially, like, if you look at, like, the Firelands tier, when the Arcane Ages are actually able to get Dragon's Wrath, Arcane just kind of takes off and leaves the other two specs in the dust. So Arcane, I think, is just always solid. It always does really good single target damage. It has its new mana mastery just makes it even more bursty, and like we talked about, there's some pretty important burst checks in phase one, and then that becomes more plentiful in phase two and three. So Arcane is just going to be valuable in that regard too. It still does bring focus magic, which is a crit buff to somebody who really enjoys crit. So it's bringing that little bit of utility. Of course, it's a mage, so it brings time warp. It brings the spell power buff. So Arcane is just really sitting pretty when it comes to. Oh, why did I move that there? I'm bugging. Arcane is sitting pretty when it comes to its damage, viability, and utility. So I'm gonna put Arcane in the 8 tier, and it's another spec that's not too affected by like there was no major nerfs in like 4.3, right? There was honestly just buffs for fire just to kind of compete with Arcane. But Arcane is pretty solid, like more than solid, I should say. Obviously, I put it in the platinum no features. Assassination. So Assassination, I think, edges out combat and goes to A tier. I'm gonna do a little brief little thing on combat. Combat is, you know what? Where's the combat one? Can I move this over here? I can. I'm gonna move it up real quick because I'm gonna kind of talk about these both. So combat, to me, combat is easier to play, and sometimes that can be better, right? Sometimes that can be just a buff in and of itself. If you have solid damage and you have not really a complex rotation for both single target and AoE, that can kind of put you over the top. And I don't think combat is bad in any regard. I just think assassination just kind of takes the cake. And like for combat, it's like infamous because I guess rogue technically is all infamous, but combat's kind of infamous because it has the legendary daggers, which all rogues obviously get. It has the legendary daggers that aren't really bis for them, right? So it has legendary daggers, has a legendary weapon that's not really bis for its class. And combat, obviously, we know combat. Even though all rogues do this, combat was the more physical centric rogue. Even though combat has poisons, but it never really put its foot in magic damage like assassination does. But assassination just kind of takes the cake. And with assassination just scaling so much better than combat, it kind of has to go in the platinum no features thing. So I'm gonna probably do both of these at the same time. So I'd put combat in, and I think combat starts off strong. But I always think combat starts off strong. Like physical classes, excluding Frost DK and maybe Feral Druid too, but physical classes tend to start off weaker, like pure physical classes. So Warriors, Fury, RIP Fury, like Warriors, and I'm kind of foreshadowing here, but Marksmen, like they tend to start off weaker because they take more gear, right? Combat kind of avoids that. Like rogues were never super gear dependent, but it's still one of those classes that still needs a little bit of gear for help. So I keep doing that. That keeps happening. So what I'm gonna say is, I think assassination definitely goes in the platinum no features, which is A tier, and I think combat can go probably in PugChamp, because you could probably carry a phase as a combat rogue, right? Like I said, it's simple to play. It has easy cooldowns. Like you don't really have to think about their cooldowns. You don't have to really think about not Shadow Step. What is it? Killing Spree. You don't really have to think about Adrenaline Rush. It has easy cooldowns to use. It's simplistic in its playstyle. Phantom Knives is, pretty okay AoE. So combat, I think, goes in the PugChamp category. And then assassination goes in the A tier. Boomy. Big Boomy. I think I would put Boomkin in also platinum no feature. Now, Boomkins are different, and Druids by virtue are different, because with Druids, they bring unique utility, right? So, especially Boomkin. Like, Boomkin has Solar Beam, right? Boomkin has Solar Beam. Druids have Battle Res, and it's a ranged Battle Res, right? So, like, as an example, sometimes if you are, let's say, a Feral Druid, like DPS Feral Druid, someone dies and you have the battle res them. Sometimes you have to run away from the boss, find the corpse, beat res them, then run back, or Feral Charge or Feral Leap back. Boomkins literally, if they have a mouse over macro, they can mouse over, hit res, and continue on like nothing ever happened. So it's a little bit easier to get the battle res off, right? Again, they have solar beam, they have mushrooms, they have they have varying profiles of damage and good utility, even though some of that utility is shared with the other specs like Stampeding Roar. Boomkins bring enough utility, solar beam, typhoon, mushrooms, I'm repeating myself, that, and their damage is pretty solid, that I think it warrants them to be in the A tier. Platinum, no features. BM. So with BM, it's better than it was in Wrath. I will give it that. BM has come a long way because it was definitely like F tier in Wrath, right? You did not play BM unless you just really wanted to parse as a BM to beat the 10 people that were playing that spec, right? But in Cata, it's different because BM literally becomes like a Swiss Army knife of buffs. And if you've seen my raid buff, like where I went over all of the different raid buffs in debuffs video for Cata, you know I kind of have a disdain for that. I don't really like BM being able to bring every single buff by virtue of its pet. Like, I don't think it should be able to bring heroism. I don't think it should be able to bring fortitude. I don't think it should be able to bring, like, sure, I think the allure of a hunter should be two things. It should be a very mobile range DPS, right? It's kind of stuck to that niche since its inception. And providing a large amount of buffs. But I don't think it should be able to bring every single buff. Like, that's kind of weird in a large amount of debuffs. So, but I will say in Cata, because the damage kind of got boosted up, it kind of works in its favor in Cata, because I think while it doesn't do the most single target, and it definitely doesn't do more AoE than the other hunter counterpart, I think because it does something that the other hunter specs can't do, because it has exotic pets and exotic pets, like I think it's the Core Hound in Cata, brings heroism, and marksman and survival can't tame Core Hounds. I think I would put it in the PugChamp category because it does solid damage and it brings buffs that the other specs and other classes can't bring. Like, so I kind of, because it has increased utility and its damage has gotten way better since Wrath, I got to put it in that category. There's an argument that it can be in the play with friends category, but I think it does more damage than to be just put in that category, right? Blood DK, Big Blood, my favorite class, my favorite spec. Y'all know what time it is. Blood DK, to me, I'm gonna be honest with y'all. Blood DK is like, if it ain't platinum, no features, is definitely up here. Blood is a really, really powerful tank, and I'm not saying that just because I play Blood. I've mained Blood. I've played Blood for years, and I've played Death Knight for years, and it's my favorite class. Blood is just innately just strong in Cataclysm, and I think a lot of the weaknesses that Blood had in Wrath, they kind of get fixed in Cata, right? A main weakness that Blood had was in Cata, especially if you're doing dungeons and stuff, its AoE threat was very, very slow and ramped up. In Cata, that's not even a thing. You drop D&D, you hit Blood Boy, and you move. That's it. You ain't got to worry about nothing, right? You hit Outbreak, you drop D&D, Outbreak, Blood Boy, and you move on with life. Plain and simple, right? Its capstone talent, which is Dancing Rune Weapon, actually is a defensive now, right? It gives you 20% parry. Phenomenal for a Blood DK, right? Parry is really, really good, and especially in the Cata version of Blood DK, parry is really, really good. In some cases, you're probably going to be gemming parry and mastery for your armor, for your yellow slots to get that orange gem. So Blood has really, really come a long way there. So its capstone talent isn't useless. Its AoE damage profile has gone up dramatically. It still has all of the CDs that we're used to. Vamp Blood, Icebound Fortitude, Anti-Magic Shell. Still brings all of that stuff. It still brings A-Bomb's Might, right? This is not really for utility, but this is just kind of like a good flavor ability. For flavor, Dark Simulacrum is a cool ability where you place it on an enemy, and the next spell that it casts copies it, and now you can use it for your own for a short amount of time. Like, that ability is phenomenal. Like, if you've never used that ability, just make a Death Knight and try it out. Like, it works on players, it works on most mobs in Kata, it works on some bosses. I vividly remember putting up Dark Simulacrum on my Heroic Ragnaros progression when I was playing Frost DK and copying his I don't remember what the ability was called. It wasn't World in Flame, it wasn't Engulfing Flames, but it was a big AoE. It didn't do a lot of damage, but it did enough damage that I felt like a dead button could be a powerful button, especially if used at the right time. So it was a really good button. But going back to Blood is just really, really strong. And in part, what makes it strong is not just the fixes that happened from Wrath to Kata, but its mastery. Its mastery, Blood Shield, was really, really, really strong in Cataclysm. Like, mastery in its inception was just really powerful for a lot of classes, and Blood was just one of those classes where the Blood Shield mastery just kind of by and large set itself apart from a lot of the other tanks, right? And when you couple that with the 4.3 changes that Blood got, Blood got some really important 4.3 changes. I think most notably, probably the most impactful one was the Death Strike change, where Death Strike still healed you, whether or not it hit or not, or whether it was dodged or parried, because that was a really big problem that Blood was kind of tied to. It's like you were kind of tied to your expertise and your hit rating, because if your Death Strike parried, if your Death Strike missed, you can't heal. And not healing on a spec that kind of is centered around its self-healing and its longevity was really bad. So I think the 4.3 change that made Death Strike just heal you regardless of whether it hit or not, or whether it was avoided or not, was phenomenal. Blood also got some other changes too, some also really, really good changes. Blade Barrier being passive, it's not a maintenance buff, right? It's just you just take reduced damage taken, really, really good. Even though Blade Barrier was never something that was super, super hard to keep up, like just natural play kind of kept the Blade Barrier. But that was really good. The armor increase from in Blood Presence was really good. Blood just became really already strong. It just became really, really strong in 4.3. And I think Blood is just a phenomenal tank. For real. Enhance. Enhance is weird because Enhance got a lot of buffs in 4.3, and of course it's a shaman, so it brings a lot of utility. All specs of shaman do, but Enhance, specifically brings the attack speed buff. Enhance all shamans bring heroism, we know that. Shamans also bring the spell haste buff. Enhance brings the attack power buff through Unleash Rage. So Enhance brings a lot of buffs with it. Its damage profile, if this was 4.0 or 4.1, I would say it probably isn't the best, right? But Enhance also got a lot of buffs in in patch 4.3 that kind of brought it in line with the others. And it got a lot of burst damage, which again we talked about earlier, is that burst damage became of higher importance the later you go on into Cataclysm. Probably the most infamous thing is the Spine of Deathwing fight, where you're DPSing those tendons when the plates lift up for a short amount of time. Like Enhance, Frost DK, Arcane, like all those specs really, really benefited because they did a lot of burst damage, did a lot of damage in a short amount of time. And it wasn't even like a lot of burst damage with a long cooldown. No, it was frequent. It was like almost every single time. So Enhance gets a lot more value later on by virtue of its damage profile and the buffs that it gets. So I will say, like I said, if this was the early Kata, we're talking about 4.0, 4.1, I would be like, Enhance isn't really there. But because of the way it plays and because of the buffs that it got, let me see if I can just find just some off rip. So let's see. So Enhance got a change of Maelstrom weapon. Its mental quickness talent got buffed. Improved Lava Lash got buffed. Like Enhance was there. So I'm gonna actually put Enhance in the solid tier because I don't think it's even by virtue of its utility, you could say it can go up here, right? But these specs, well, at least for Arcane and for for balance. These specs bring a similar level of utility, right? Arcane again brings spell power. It brings focus magic. It brings heroism. Balance brings kings. It brings a battle res. It brings a unique utility in solar beam and stampeding roar. And assassin brings certain buffs too, but its damage profile is a lot higher than the other specs. So you kind of got to put it there. So yeah, I will put enhance as solid. I will put enhance as solid with an argument for being up here, just dependent on how important it's really going to be for our burst to be, how important burst profiles are going to be in Cataclysm, basically. So I'll put it right there. Oh, no, I'm bugging. There we go. Demonology. Let's talk about it. So Demo, I think, goes in platinum, no features. For real. And Demo is not unlike the other Warlock specs that it still brings summoning, it still brings health stones, it still brings soul stones for quick reses if someone dies, right? It still brings all that stuff. But Demo is in a unique category because instead of bringing the 6% spell power buff like Arcane does, it brings the 10% spell power buff by virtue of Demonic Pact. So Demo is a little different. It also brings Dark Intent, which obviously the other Warlock specs do, because Dark Intent is just it's a haste buff. But Dark Intent is like the Warlock version of Focus Magic, which can be very beneficial to somebody who really benefits from haste, like Resto Druids, like Shadow Priests, like Fire Mages. Like Dark Intent can really bump up a lot of damage. So Demo, I think, brings really good utility on top of the damage profile that it does. Like Demo does really strong damage, both single target and AoE. Specifically stacked AoE, like spread AoE is kind of meh for Demo, but stacked AoE, you're going to be going off with Hand of Godon, supplemented by Shadow Flame, supplemented by Cremation. Like you're going to really go off as a Demo with stacked AoE. And its single target isn't bad either. So Demonology, I think, just by virtue of just being a little bit stronger than the other two specs and still providing a better spell power buff, which is unique to Demo, like Destruction and Affliction can't bring that. I think you got to go A tier here. What's next? Elemental. So Elemental's interesting, right? Because prior to Cataclysm, I would say that Shamans really don't scale the best. I mean, we saw that in Wrath, right? Elemental started really strong in Nax. It was still kind of strong in Old War, but then you kind of started to see the other classes really kind of take fruition because Elemental really doesn't scale well with a lot of the stats that came about in Wrath, right? With Haste and Crit, we saw mages take off. Well, not just mages, but mages, Shadow Priests, Warlocks, like all those classes kind of take off the more gear that you get and the more stats that you get, coupled by the fact that a lot of those classes had really good set bonuses, and I think for me, in my opinion, Elemental just kind of had like a really lackluster set bonus. So we kind of saw Elemental dip pretty much from where it was at in Phase 1. Like if you look at Phase 1 Ellie and you look at right now Ellie, it really is not the same at all. It's like almost night and day. But in Cataclysm, a lot of things happen. So in regards to Phase 1, with Phase 1 with 4.3 changes, I think Ellie's really going to stand out. I think Ellie's going to surprise and shock a lot of people. And I'm going to put it in A tier, which would be platinum. I'm going to put it in A tier. You know what? I should probably, let's see. How would I tier this? You know what? No, I don't want to do it individual tiers. I'll just leave it like what it is. But I'm going to put Ellie in A tier for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think it's going to kind of combat that scaling issue by just all the buffs that it gets in 4.3, right? It gets a really big earthquake damage, helping its AoE profile. It gets a really nice talent change where Chain Lightning can be either a 3 or a 5 talent point thing, because I think it removes the cooldown, like Elemental Fury, I think removes the cooldown for Chain Lightning, right? It gets a talent change in shamanism, increasing its rotational spells. Um, its fire elemental got buffed. The speller coefficient got buffed. So there's a lot to be said about elemental. And on the plus side, I'll say this: come the Firelands tier was a really 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 good tier for Ellie. It got a really strong tier, right, making the fire elemental, which is the strongest cooldown at this moment, basically up a lot more. I think it was either Flame Shock or Lightning Bolt that reduced the cooldown of Fire Elemental, which was nutty. And you couple that with the fact that Dragon Wrath exists and some Elemental Shamans are going to have Dragon's Wrath, and it's just going to be phenomenal for them. Like, Elemental's really going to be strong. And I think the 4.3 changes, coupled with the fact that Ellie's going to be strong from the rip, which is a pretty big Shaman thing. Shamans are pretty strong in the beginning, and then they kind of slump. I think Ellie's going to be strong in the beginning and just go up, because it's strong in phase 1. It's going to get so much stronger in Firelands. Dragon Soul is kind of meh, but I think it's still going to be a pretty good contender here. That's its damage profile. As far as utility, we know what Shamans bring to the table, right? Elemental specifically brings almost the same utility as Enhance does, albeit there's some things that Elemental... I mean, that's not really anything that it doesn't bring outside of. I would say the only thing that it's unique in is its Totem of Wrath, the 10%. It's like Demonology, Demonic Pact. Ellie can bring the 10% spell power buff because of Totem of Wrath. Enhance can't do that, so it's unique there. But it still brings all of its other totems. It still brings Heroism, right? It still brings what else does it bring? There's another thing that it brings that I'm egregiously forgetting. Oh, 5% crit. It does that. Elemental. Oh, yes, it does that. Same thing as Boomkin. Oh no, Boomkin's got changed to actually haste now. I'm tripping. But it does bring the crit buff now. No longer a Boomkin thing. Boomkins now do 5% haste, which is interesting. But yes, Ellie does bring up a nice amount of utility by itself, plus its high damage profile, plus the buffs that it got in 4.3. Pretty solid. Pretty solid. Take a swig of this water real quick. You know, looking at this, I would even say that just looking at A tier comparatively, I would even almost bump Demo to S tier, because I think Demo is better or becomes better in a lot of ways than a lot of these other specs, right? With gear. Like, I think you need a lot of gear to really make Arcane work, but Arcane, you know what? No, we're gonna leave it. I'll do a ending review at the end here, and then I'll culminate it all. But I think for now we'll leave it like this, and then we'll talk about it at the end. What's next? Fire Mage, Big Fire. So Fire is slept on. Fire is slept on because I think Arcane was so dominant prior to 4.3, and then Fire just kind of got super buffed, right? I think I have a list of some of the buffs that they did for Fire Mage here somewhere. Let me just see if I can find it right quickly. But Fire was really slept on. Okay, so some of the I'm going to talk about some of the nerfs too, because Fire also got a nerf in the 4.32 patch. But 4.3, when Dragon Soul came out, which is part of the patch that we're going to be running on when Cataclysm launches. Pyroblast's upfront damage, initial damage, got buffed by like 26%. And its damage over time got buffed by 100%. Fireball got buffed by 17%. Living Bomb got buffed by 10%. And the explosion got buffed by 120. Whoa, someone's texting me. And the biggest one, in my opinion, combustion, the dot that it leaves can now crit, which was nutty. If you know Fire, you know Fire Mages love crit, so they already had a high chance to crit, and having one of their main CDs, if not their main CD, be able to crit is phenomenal. So Fire, I think, honestly, if I'm being real, with going into it with 4.3, I think Fire goes S tier. I struggle to find an argument where it couldn't be S tier. I think Fire goes S tier. Now, and of course, Fire is a mage, so it brings the spell power buffs. Like in terms of utility, now it brings the spell power buff. It brings heroism. In terms of unique utility, I think Fire. I'm pretty sure there was a debuff that Fire brought. Let me double check before I just say they don't do anything. They don't have Focus Magic because Focus Magic is now locked into Arcane. They do have a debuff, Critical Mass. That's what it's called, Critical Mass. It's a 5% spell crit debuff. So Fire does bring a unique, and this debuff is only brought by Fire in one other spec, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But so it's pretty unique in that regard, on top of bringing the spell power buff, heroism, decurse, which I guess all mages can do now. So that's fine. But on top of the damage profile plus the utility plus the unique buff in critical mass, Fire is S tier. Now, Fire did get nerfed. I talked about that. Fire did get a slight nerf in the 4.32 patch. Fireball got nerfed and Pyroblast got nerfed, but they both only got nerfed by 6%. Fire was still taking names. Moving on. We're going to get this out the way. I'm sorry, Frost. Bow. That's just how we living. Frost just needs a help. Like, this is before the times where Frost got Flurry and Winter's Chill and the Iceland. Like, yeah, Frost just needs help. It's still regarded as a really, really strong PvP spec. And I feel like Frost was always kind of like that. But Frost just really isn't a good PvE spec. PvP is pretty solid, but PvE is just not a good spec. Its mastery didn't even save it either. Like, I know it's changed now. I think it was the I don't remember the name of it, but the mastery that Frost had in Cataclysm like increased the water elemental damage or something silly. I guess I shouldn't say silly because water elemental was a big part of their damage, but it was water elemental damage and it was another damage increase that ultimately just didn't matter. Frost was just pretty bad. I'm sorry, Frost. Feral Druid. Feral, I think, goes in solid. Feral is a spec that also, I think, gets slept on a lot because it's a druid. It's a spec that's shared with 3 other specs because you're sharing Guardian, you're sharing Balance, and Resto. And for a long time, the other 3 specs would perform better, if not outright by performance, but outright by we already had a druid, so we don't really need a Feral Druid. Like, Feral wasn't really unique. You know what I mean? Like, especially if you had a Guardian Druid. If you had a Guardian Druid, you really didn't really need a Feral Druid. Its damage profile was really baked into its bleeds. Feral's another spec that I talked about mastery earlier, but Feral's another spec that its mastery was really strong. Its bleed damage really was strong. And you saw, like, the Matrix Trinket that dropped from Firelands really, really, really contributed to a lot of Feral damage. But that type of damage profile is damage over time. There are other classes that have strong damage over time effects and don't really require a lot of mastery scaling or specific items to get there. You know what I mean? So I think Feral goes into solid because it's not a bad spec and it still brings the druid utility that we all like. We like Stampeding Roar. We like Battle Res. So it brings the utility that we love as a druid. But it's like, all right, if you have a choice between Feral and you have a choice between, like, if you're trying to fill a melee spot, Feral is not going to be at the top of your list, or unless you don't have a druid, which is unlikely considering you have 4 specs to choose from, or 3, not including Feral. You have 3 other specs to choose from, and for the most part, they were raised that had Resto Druids. They were raised that had Boomkins. You might not have had a Guardian Druid, but we're going to talk about we're going to talk about why you should have had a Guardian Druid and its strength level, but because all 3 of those specs were really performing really well in Cataclysm, it kind of overshadowed Feral. But Feral's not a bad spec. I think it's better than PugChamp, even though a good druid can definitely slap a pug. But I think it goes right into solid. For real. In regards to its damage profile, like nerfs, buffs, changes in 4.3 and 4.32, I'd have to say I have some notes here. I don't think Feral got anything too crazy, but let me double check because I don't want to not speak on something. I know they got a swipe buff, or not buff, nerf. I'm bugging. But that was really it. Now I'm looking at it. 4.3 wasn't really nothing crazy for Feral. So yeah, I think Feral's solid. Nothing super crazy. Better than PugChamp and Player Friends and Cap and all that stuff. So there we have it. Fury. So Fury might be one of those ones where I'm kind of torn. I would put it here in Cap, but you could probably make an argument for Play with Friends. I remember a large problem with Fury was that, number one, its mastery was just pretty bad. And it was really, really gear dependent. I mean, that's like the warrior, story of the warrior's life, right? Gear dependency. But I do remember the mastery being pretty bad. And and the crazy part is the mastery for warrior hasn't really changed much. Like, if you look at it throughout Mastery's inception, which it was Cataclysm, if you look at the mastery for Fury specifically, it didn't really change that much. Like, it's kind of crazy, but it didn't really change that much for Fury. So with Fury, because it's gear dependency, because it's damn sure not doing more damage than an arms warrior, that's a fact. I would reserve it to probably Playing with Friends, but it really should be here. Like, the thing though is with Fury, like, it's probably better than Frost, so I'll probably put Play with Friends. Play with Friends, but it really probably should be. You probably shouldn't play Fury. That's what I'll say. Fury's like a spec that you play, like, if you're an arms warrior, Fury's the spec that you play when, like, you have everything on farm and you're bored of playing arms and you want to do something different. And then you realize it's bad and then you go back to playing arms. But yeah, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to put it there. You can put Fury and Play with Friends, but it should really be there. Destruction. So Destruction actually got a nice buff in 4.3. It wasn't really direct. Was it direct? I know there was a talent buff. There were 2 talent buffs that I guess you can call direct buffs, right? They also changed. This was a big one. They also changed Shadow Burn to actually do Shadow Flame damage, which is Shadow and Fire. So now it correlates with the Destruction's Mastery. So Destruction Mastery, before it got changed to what it is now, it used to just increase all fire damage you did, but the problem with Shadow Burn did shadow damage. I always found that weird. Like, even like when I play SOD, I pressed Shadow Form, I spec'd into it, not Shadow Form, Shadow Burn, I spec'd into it one time, and I had no idea that it did shadow damage, even though it's in the goddamn name, and I just had no idea because Destro's a fire-centric talent build, and I'm trying to build up fire, so I thought it would be a great talent. Then I realized, this doesn't get buffed by Ember Storm. This doesn't matter if I have a whole bunch of plus damage to fire spells. Shadow Burn is useless, and I had no idea that it wasn't until the second to last patch in Kata is when Shadow Burn got changed to actually do fire damage. That's kind of nutty when you think about it like that. But in terms of tiering, because of the buff and its, I guess, Warlock utility, I'd probably put it PugChamp. I don't think it's better than Affliction, even though it can be, but the problem is Affliction's a lot more mobile. Like, Destruction's still a turret spec, especially since it got Chaos Bolt. You definitely don't want to clip your Chaos Bolt or delay your Chaos Bolt. So it's still kind of a turret spec. It did get some pretty decent buffs in 4.3 with no recourse, like no nerfs. Let me see if I could just bring up the actual list. Yeah, Fire and Brimstone increasing your Incinerate and your Chaos Bolt on immolated targets. Burning Embers increasing your Soulfire, like, and your imp damage. The Shadow Burn change was really big. So like, Destruction got some pretty decent buffs, but it wasn't beating Affliction in my opinion, and it's damn sure not beating Demo. And it's bringing unique utility in Shadow Flame, right? Like the 5% crit, like only Destro can bring that. Right? I'm pretty sure Shadow and Flame Burn did that. I have to see how high it is, but I'm pretty sure only Destro can bring that. Let me double check before I just say that as gospel. But if that is the case, it is bringing a unique debuff. I'm going to double check right now because I don't want to get killed again. That's why you got to double check things, ladies and gents. And Shadow Flame is in the first tier of the Destruction tree, so any Warlock can really bring it. Yeah, Destruction got to be PugChamp. Its damage is good enough that I think it's better than Play with Friends or putting it in F tier, but it doesn't bring really any unique utility that the other specs can't bring. So yeah, it got to be PugChamp. Now, who's to say that it doesn't, like, the player, like I said with the Arms Warrior and the Arms Warrior nerf that not nerf, but slight that it got. I think it was in 4.1, where they reduced the two-handed weapon specialization from, I think, like 20 to 10 for arms. That probably didn't matter too much back then, right? But now that we have multiple, like we have a warrior community, we have multiple people playing warrior, you can sim things, you can do whatever. That nerf might look a little different in today's landscape, and it might be more impactful for warrior than it was back then. Same thing with Destro. Like the buffs that it got might be more impactful, but I don't think it's going to be more impactful than Affliction Demo. So yeah, I think Destro's a puck champ. It's probably a fun spec probably, but I don't think it beats the other. I can't in my right mind with a comfortable like constitution put it in the same tier as Feral, Enhance, or Affliction. So it got to be a bug champ. It does bring Shadow Flame though, but all the things can bring Shadow Flame. So sorry, Destro. Okay, Frost DK. So in my Melee stream when I did this a while ago, I put Frost DK at the top. I put it in S tier, right? And again, this is me thinking because number one, I was a Frost DK throughout the entirety of Cata and Mop and part of WoD and when I came back in Legion. With Frost, the 4.3 variant, if this was 4.1 or 4.0 going into 4.1, I would say, yeah, Frost is S tier easily because Frost is, whenever you have a spec that doesn't need a lot of gear, pretty easy to play, has a high, what's the word? What is it? Has a short cooldown rotation because Pillar of Frost is the main cooldown, right? It's a minute. Does a lot for DK, increases your strength by like 20%. And you can use it throughout, like when you have fights that last 4 or 5 minutes, you're getting 5 to 6 uses of your main CD. There's not a lot of classes that can say that, right? Like, I know we're not talking about it right now, but like I'll move it up just to put it side by side. Ret Paladin, right? Zealotry and Wings are on 2 and 3 minute cooldowns. They can't get as many uses out of those two abilities than Frost can out of Pillar of Frost. You know what I mean? Like Unholy, Gargoyle is a 3 minute cooldown. You're getting 2, maybe 3 uses out of Gargoyle on most fights. Some fights, like I know Ragnaros is infamous. Ragnaros is like a 20-minute fight, so you're getting mad uses out of that. But like Ragnaros is the exception, not the rule. And even if you look at something like Ragnaros, let's say, is a 15-minute fight. That's 15 uses on Pillar of Frost versus 5 on Gargoyle. See what I'm saying? On top of the fact that it's simplicity. All you really have to do is follow the killing machine and you really just want to use it on Obliterate if you can. So with Frost, I gotta put it in A tier. Now, looking at, you know what, because this has been bugging me ever since I started the stream, I think I would move Arcane down. And I'll talk about that later. But when I go over it at the end, but I gotta move Arcane. I'm just looking at it. I'm like, I think Arcane can come down. But Frost, because of its simplicity, because of its damage profile, it's good on single target. It's good on AOE. More so stacked than spread, but you still have Pestilence for things like that. But it's really good on single target. It's not the best on 2 target and 3 target cleave, but it's still pretty good. Howling Blast still makes up a lot of damage. Frost Fever still makes up a decent amount of damage. So it's really good at single target and AOE. It's really good at burst. Obviously, we just talked about that. And we talked about how burst becomes more important the later you go into Cataclysm. It's pretty important in the first phase, right? I talked about how Sinistra, the eggs, are really important to burst down. That's that's where you want a lot of burst damage. Cho'Gall, killing the ads before they, reach players. That's another important burst fight. I'm trying to think if there's another one that stands out. Magmar, kinda in blocking Descent. You don't really want the skeleton add up too much, so I would call that more priority than burst, because you could have him up for a decent amount of time and just kind of ignore it if you're tanking your healers on point and just kill Magmar. There's no super urgency to kill that, so I don't know if I count that as a burst one. So we'll exclude that one. Maybe even Nefarian is another one that's in certain points in that fight you need to either kill the ads or kill Onyxia. You don't want Onyxia up too long. And on top of all of that stuff, Frost still does bring some pretty decent stuff. I think most notably the change that I like about Frost that they did in terms of utility is allowing Frost to bring the 4% physical debuff. I think famously, or if you want to say infamously, in Wrath that was only brought by combats and arms was non-existent in Wrath, so basically combat. But giving it to Frost DK, I just think makes so much sense. And of course, as a Death Knight, it's going to bring Horn of Winter, which is the strength and agility. It's going to bring the attack speed buff, which is Icy Talons. It's going to bring the Frost Fever debuff, the attack speed slow. So it's still going to bring certain stuff. Obviously, there's other classes that can bring this, but the 4% physical one is one. It's not unique to Frost because combat still does it. Arms still does it, and there's a hunter pet that does it, which annoys me to no end. But there's a hunter pet that does it, so there's still 3 other ways to get this debuff. But I think Frost is the best way to get this. It's definitely the spec that does the most damage for that debuff. So, with all that being said, I'm putting Frost in A tier. Retribution Paladin. So Retribution can go 2 ways. I think you can either go in solid or A. Let's put it down here. Let's talk about it first before I actually tier it. So with Ret Paladin, Ret got a lot of changes. Paladin in general got a lot of changes with the way seals work, buff consolidation, the way auras work, the talent trees changing up. It got a new ability in Templar's Verdict. So Ret definitely got a lot of changes. The introduction to Holy Power, arguably, to me, is the biggest change, not just for Ret, but for all Paladins. But the introduction to Holy Power, I think, arguably is the biggest change for Ret because there was a lot of abilities, Templar's Verdict, namely, for a single target, that was fueled by Holy Power, right? I think where Ret falters is it's not really the greatest in low target cleave, like 2 target cleave, 3 target cleave. And that's really because of the way Divine Storm works. Divine Storm hits 4 targets, but it only generates a Holy Power if it hits 4 targets, right? So let's say if there's the boss and then there's an ad that needs to get cleaved, Ret kind of always struggled there, right? In that low target, unless you were hitting that sweet spot where Divine Storm was generating Holy Power, you really weren't seeing that much power there. Ret was really good on single target though. It was a burst powerhouse. Right, I think I talked a little bit earlier about Zealotry and Avenging Wrath, but Ret has always been a burst powerhouse. I want to see if I can actually put up Zealotry here so people can see real quick. Hold on 1 second. Let me do this because it's easy to. Sometimes I even forget like what some of these things do. Hold on, shrink this down a little bit. Pardon me, guys. All right. Here we are. I don't want to maximize that. So, yeah, Zealotry is the new capstone talent, and it's 2 minutes, right? And it causes your Crusader Strike. It's very simple. In fact, I think this effect, got changed to Holy Avenger. And instead of it just being Ret, it was like Holy Avenger was a talent that all of the Paladins could take. And I loved Holy Avenger before when I played Prot a little bit. But anyway, Zealotry. So, basically, it just makes your Crusader Strike. It costs 3 Holy Power, so you have to have 3 Holy Power to use it. But it doesn't spend it, if that makes sense. So once you generate 3 Holy Power, you can now use Zealotry. And it causes your Crusader Strike to just generate 3 charges of Holy Power. So what that really means is you can kind of follow the if it's single target, you can kind of follow, and this is a very watered down version, so grain of salt. But you can kind of follow the rotation of Crusader Strike, max power Templar's Verdict. Crusader Strike, max power Templar's Verdict. And you're just getting so much damage. And 2 minutes is not a long time. It's not as short as Pillar of Frost, obviously, but 2 minutes is a pretty short time for an incredible burst like that. On top of Avenging Wrath and all of the other things that work for Ret Paladin. But I think with Ret, like I said, its main weakness just lies in the fact that it struggles in 2 target cleave scenarios, because Divine Storm, which is like its driving force for its AoE, or for at least its cleaved AoE, only generates Holy Power if it hits 4 or more targets. So if you're above 4 targets, yeah, Ret's going to be great because it's going to be doing a lot of damage because Divine Storm does a lot of damage, and it's going to be generating Holy Power. But if you're at 3 or under, it's going to struggle a little bit. On top of the fact that the new maintenance buff that Rhett has, Inquisition, um, isn't really isn't really remembered fondly because it was a buff that it did well, right? It was a buff that increased all of your holy damage done. So it was a nice buff. It wasn't like a bullshit buff. It was a nice buff, but it cost holy power, right? And it just felt terrible using your holy power, your hard-earned new resource, to just maintain a buff. And the thing with Inquisition is that it lasted longer the more holy power you spent, up to 3. So if you spent 3 holy power on it, you got the longest duration. And I didn't main ret, but I can only imagine generating 3 holy power and then having to refresh Inquisition. That probably didn't feel great. I'm gonna be honest with you. That probably did not feel great. So ret between the maintenance buff, between its weakness in certain levels of cleave, I think kind of hold it back a little bit. Now it's still a paladin. It's still bringing utility, kind of unique to paladin. Like it's bringing the various auras. It's bringing kings, even though kings isn't unique anymore. It's still bringing might. It's still bringing things that only paladins can bring. So it's still got to get looked at for that in terms of utility. And in terms of damage, single target is great. Targets more than 4 is great. I would say ret probably can be put up in solid. In terms of like the 4.3 changes, I don't think ret got that much. I'm gonna be honest with you. I'd have to check my notes, but from memory, I don't think ret got, like, I'm talking about buffs or nerfs. I have to double check. Let me see. I know 4.3 was big for Holy Paladin, but in terms of ret, I think they just kind of buffed like one of the passives for 4.3. Let me double check. Yeah, so they changed Sanctified Wrath to increase the crit chance. But that was a nerf kinda. And they did buff the passive. Yeah, like this is the passive I was talking about. The 2-handed weapon specialization went from 20 to 25. I guess that's kind of cool, right? And we're talking about 5% buff. If you have a good weapon, this is really good. Yeah, I think ret goes into solid. It's not super crazy. I don't think it's better. Like if you, by comparison, I don't think it's better if I'm comparing it to the other melee in A tier, which is Frost and Assassination. I don't think it's better than those two guys. Maybe Assassination. I definitely don't think it's better than Frost, but ret is not bad. It's not a bad spec. Not a bad spec at all. What's next? We got Bear. Guardian. Guardian's a strong tank, yo. Guardian's a strong tank. I would actually put it up here. I'd put it in A tier. I'm gonna be real. Cataclysm is just the year of the Guardian Druid, like the expansion of the Guardian Druid. Guardian is a really, really strong tank in Cat. Let me just take a drink of water. Guardian is another tank that just benefited from a very powerful mastery. So Guardian always kind of, not always, but in Wrath, Guardian had the passive Savage Defense, which I think your auto attacks just gave you a chance to absorb the next melee auto attack from whatever you were tanking. The Savage Defender mastery that Guardian got in Cataclysm buffed that dramatically. It's almost like Blood Shield. Just you don't have direct control over it. It's like just a passive Blood Shield. And when you couple that with the high stamina that it gets from Bear form, the high armor value that it gets from Bear form, what else did they change in? It was stamina, armor, it was the utility that they get, Stampeding Roar, Rears, all that stuff. Guardian, and they really Guardian wasn't the greatest in single target threat in Wrath, like, which is kind of weird because they were the best single target threat in Kata and arguably the best in Vanilla, not in Kata, in TBC. Best single target threat in TBC, arguably the best in Vanilla, and maybe that's not even arguably. That's probably just a definitive the best in Vanilla. But to see them go down in single target threat in Wrath kind of was weird. But then in Kata, thanks to Vengeance, even though Vengeance helped all the tanks, Bear's different because a lot of their abilities just scaled off attack power and was physical. So it was just between the Vengeance and Vengeance scaled off of their max health. And Guardian, as we all know, has a lot of health. They have a lot of health modifiers. They have a lot of health. So Guardian was just eating just off of various different plates. The Vengeance plate, the Mastery Amp plate, we just got buffed innately plate. Like, yeah, Guardian is just over the top. Guardian's over the top. If I have, obviously I'm always going to prefer Blood DK because even though Savage Defender and Blood Shield work similarly, I much rather be able to control it by Ritual Blood Shield than just have it passive work. as the way Savage Defender works. But Guardian is incredible. Guardian is an incredible tank. And that's a shame because it kind of overshadows Pharaoh in a way. And that's kind of always been the case. Like, not just for Guardian and Pharaoh specifically, but whenever you have one good spec of Druid, people are going to bring that spec, and then it's just going to devalue bringing the other specs. So it's kind of a shame, but I can't deny that Guardian is an amazing tank. I'm going to be real with y'all. Okay, we got? Marksman. Ugh. Marksman, I'm sorry. Marksman got to go here. I would say, you know what? Because I think Marksman is still better than Frost and Fury, I think I'd go play with we go play with friends. We'll go play with friends with Marksman. So the thing with Marksman is, just by comparison of the other Hunter specs, we'll get to the other range DPS, but by comparison of the other Hunter specs, it definitely can't compete with the damage profiles of Survival, right? So it's faulted there. It can't bring the same utility that BM brings because it can't tame exotic pets, right? One of the things that Marksman, I guess, does have going for it is it can bring the attack power buff. It can still bring a lot of debuffs and buffs because it still contains pets, and pets are the ones that bring the buffs. But you always have to ask yourself, if you're considering a Marksman, what are you bringing the Marksman for, right? If it's the attack power buff, there's way better classes that bring that buff before you even get to Marksman. Blood DK brings it, which we already talked about, is a phenomenal tank. Ret Paladin brings it, or just Paladin. I shouldn't even say Ret, but Paladin. In terms of DPS, Paladins bring it because Blessing of Might does that now. Enhance does that with Unleashed Rage. Like, so you really don't need True Shot Aura, right? Not for that. Like you don't need to bring Marksman for that, right? So that's number one. On the debuff side, if you're going to bring a Hunter to provide a debuff, you might as well just bring a BM Hunter. And that's the reality of the situation, right? And in terms of his damage profile, I'll say this. Single target, BM and Marksman probably close. Probably close, right? AoE is different, and then Survival is just not even close. Survival blows both of those specs out the water. Foreshadowing. So Marksman, I think, is a spec that you just kind of got to reserve to playing with friends. If you're going to be... Now, granted, there's always the one person or a couple people who feel like it doesn't matter what spec you bring. Just be good at the game. That part is true, right? But when you're picking something that's notoriously bad or deemed bad by the community, you kind of got to eat what goes with it. So as an example, if I decide to main Frost Mage for my Cata experience, I could be the best Frost Mage in the world, right? I could do great numbers. I'm still providing heroism. I'm still providing the spell power buff, right? All that is fine and dandy. However, I have to know my limitations, and I have to know the environment that I'm playing in. Frost has clear limitations in comparison to Fire and Arcane, right? And I'm not going to do the same damage as Frost if I was Fire, if I was Arcane. So a performance issue comes into play when I'm looking at the guild. So now I have to choose a guild where it may not matter what kind of progression we're doing, and then I can just kind of play Frost, right? But I think Frost is just kind of bad. Its damage is not good enough to even warrant playing with friends. I was just using it as an example. Marksman, I think its damage is still not good, but you can play with friends, and it's still a Hunter. It still brings a lot of utility just by the various pets that it can bring. So I would say you could put it in the play with friends tier. I'm sure if there's somebody out there who feels different, they'll put it in the comments. What's next? Looks like we're getting to the healers yet. Wow, I went through most of the DPS and I haven't done the healers yet. You know what? Let's just finish off the DPS because I didn't do ranged. I didn't do a video for ranged before, and I just want to finish it off. So let's just finish off. It looks like I only got 2 specs anyway. And I think you guys know where these specs are going. I'm gonna be real. So Shadow Priest, that's not even a question. Shadow goes up there. Shadow Priest, and it's weird because Shadow got the mastery, the Shadow Orbs, and to be quite honest, I never really was a fan of the Shadow Orb style of Shadow Priest. I know a lot of people who like it, And obviously it worked out for Shadow because it helped them perform really, really well. But I don't think it's a coincidence that Cataclysm was the only expansion that we saw the Shadow Orbs version of Shadow Priest. And now we've had what? So since Cata, we've had Mop, Wad, Legion, BFA, Shadowlands, and now we're at the end of Dragonflight. So we've had 6 expansions since Shadow Orbs, and we haven't even seen mention of it. We haven't even seen it in a talent form. We haven't seen it as a passive. We haven't seen any of it. So I don't think that's a coincidence. But I can't deny the power that it brought to Shadow Priest. And you know what? Let me just bring it up just in case people don't know what Shadow Orbs does. Let me see if I can find it here. I know one thing I don't like about the Wowhead, the talent calculator for Wowhead, is that it doesn't show the like passives that you get in the beginning. And maybe that's because I'm using it wrong, but I feel like I'm using it right and I don't see it. But I'll show you what I mean, like right here. Boop. Go to Priest. Let's bring this down and let's move this over. So like right here, the Wowhead talent calculator doesn't show you the passives that you get here. It just shows you the talent calculator. But here we have Shadow Orbs. So real quick, you can see the tooltip. I'll go over it. You have a 10% chance for your Shadow Orb Pain and Mind Flay spells to grant you a Shadow Orb each time they deal damage. Casting a Mind Blast or Mind Spike consumes all Shadow Orbs, increasing the damage of that spell by 22% per Shadow Orb and granting 22% increased damage on your periodic shadow spells for 15 seconds. So TLDR, it's a huge damage amp for both your direct and your damage over time damage, which obviously spills into AoE because Shadow Priest can multi-dot. So this Shadow Orbs mechanic was really strong. And if not to well, I shouldn't say not, but to put the cherry on top, their mastery Shadow Orbs. For each point of mastery, it scales up. So Shadow Priest was just kind of in a class of its own when it came to like the damage over time boys. And that's in no small part thanks to Shadow Orbs and the mastery. So that's kind of what I wanted to point out there. Also, not only did Shadow have incredible damage profiles, both in single target and spread AoE and a little bit of stacked, it kind of got reworked thanks to the buffs that they changed with Cataclysm. So now Shadow Form provides the 5% spell haste buff, giving Shadow Priest a lot better utility, right? And the 5% spell haste, previously you could only get it from the Wrath of Air Totem. You still can get it from Shamans, but now you can also get it from Shadow Priest and Boomkins. They've changed 5% crit on Moonkin form to 5% haste, so keep that in mind. But now Shadow Priest can bring, not only can it bring Fortitude, right? Because they can still bring Fortitude with Stamina. They can bring the 5% spell haste. They can still bring offensive and defensive spells with like things like Purify and things like Abolish Disease and Master Spell. They have Vamp Embrace, which provides a lot of passive healing because Shadow Priest does so much damage. Vamp Embrace is going to do, for lack of a better term, sizable healing across the entirety of a raid. Like, it's going to do a lot. So Shadow Priest is not slacking in the utility department. And to top it all off, it still has Divine Hymn. It still can just come out of Shadow form and cast Divine Hymn. So yeah, Shadow is definitely up there. And if not just by virtue of its damage, definitely because of its damage and its utility. Shadow's up there. And then lastly, we have Survival, and I got to put Survival up here too. Survival is too strong to ignore. Survival is weird to me because it's not even weird. I shouldn't say weird because for the most part, all of Wrath's Survival was always kind of there, right? I think in the beginning of Wrath, like at the end of TBC, pre-patch Wrath, we all kind of predicted that Marksman at some point would take over, but it never really happened the way we thought it would. Like, Marksman did become good, but it never completely eclipsed Survival, right? It never completely eclipsed Survival. Survival's kind of still stuck in there, and I think that's even more evident when they kind of shoehorned a trap launcher into Wrath, right? Like, that kind of just made Survival like, I'm here to stay. Like, I'm not going nowhere. For what? So when that happened, Survival kind of just stuck around for the long haul. And in Cata, Survival just got a lot of buffs. Now, In terms of, oh, you know what? Let me say this real quick before I forget. Shadow didn't really get any changes in 4.3 in regards to like buffs or anything like that. It was kind of untouched. But going back to survival, I think the best thing that they did for survival was the talent revamp. In my opinion, survival didn't really have the greatest talents in Wrath. Like, yeah, it had strong talents, and a lot of those talents got carried over to Cata. But I always just thought the survival talent tree was weird. But with its new, hold on, let me bring it up so I can actually see. And I keep closing this thing, but I'm gonna bring it up. I will say this though, in 4.3, survival did get a small buff where they buffed explosive shot. I think they buffed it by like 10%, 10 or 15%. Can't remember the exact number, but they did buff survival's explosive shot, and that definitely helped it because survival was already a strong spec. So buffing an already strong spec, buffing the bread and butter ability of an already strong spec is kind of nutty to me. But hey, to each his own. You know what I mean? So, but here, let me bring this up real quick. Here we go. Let's bring this over here. Scroll this down. Okay. So I think the survival tree benefited a lot from the condensing of its talents. Like the rat tree is really long and it still has a lot of the same talents, but I think condensing the talents in Cata, making a lot of the like nonsense talents passives for just innately, and it didn't just do that for survival, it did that for all of the classes. Like that was just a Cata thing. You know what I mean? But that changing that was really good. Not changing, but adapting lock and load and giving it TNT. TNT is a really, really strong talent. And I have the tooltip up here if you want to read it. But basically, when you deal periodic damage with your immolation trap, explosive trap, or black arrow, you have a 10% to trigger lock and load. That goes to 20 when you max out that talent. TNT really was like the driving force for a lot of survival's damage. And this combined with things like lock and load, things with black arrow, serpent spread, like these helped survival have not only a really strong single target, but a really strong AoE profile. And whenever you have, and it's not really, I'm jumping around, but it's not really tied to any one particular cooldown, right? Like you can argue that it's kind of tied to explosive trap, but it's really tied to just ability usage. And when you have a class that just playing the game correctly just makes you better, you have the makings of a really, really good spec. And it doesn't really matter the damage profile. It's single target, it's AoE, it's cleave, it's all of that. So survival being the most mobile range DPS, which is always at a value, that's always going to be taken at a premium. Having no qualms about the damage profile. It's good in single target. It's good in burst. It's good in cleave. It's good in AoE. That's definitely gonna help its case. It's still a hunter. It's still gonna bring pets that bring various debuffs and buffs. You can't go wrong with survival, and I think it's probably going to be one of the few specs that's going to be highly sought after. I had mentioned earlier in the stream, if you just joined or you're joined in the middle of it, I had mentioned earlier in the stream that Cata, to me, was one of the better expansions for balancing, and that tied over into Mop, which I think was the best expansion for balancing. I think Dragon Soul is pretty close, but I think Mop and Cata really take the cake for balancing, and I think it shows because excluding these three specs, right? Excluding Marksman, excluding Fury, excluding Frost, even at the top of the game, a good survival hunter, like on a single target fight, I'm not just one target, a good survival hunter and a good Destro lock, there won't be too much variance there, right? There might be maybe a 3-4% variance, 6 to 7 if the survival is really good, but there's not too much variance there, right? And that's really because Cata's balancing was really, really good. Mop's balancing was really, really good. So I think when you have those things, it just culminates for a better expansion. But survival is going to definitely be a sought after one because it's one of those specs that kind of just takes away. It kind of leaves the pack behind. all of the S tier, the no cap specs. Like I think Survival kind of leaves the rest of the pack behind. I think Shadow leaves the rest of the pack behind. I think Fire leaves the rest of the pack behind. I think Arms leaves the rest of the pack behind. So yeah, definitely Survival goes in S tier. What else DPS? Oh, we got the last two. Subtlety. Subtlety is going to be one of those play with friends. Realistically, it probably goes in here, but with decent weapons, with decent gear, and really good play, Subtlety really could be a solid spec. I think it probably does more. Can I move this up? Yeah. There we go. I think it does more damage than Marksman. I think if you get the legendary daggers, it'll make your case even more because Subtlety likes using daggers. It has a lot of dagger modifiers and stuff like that. So I think Subtlety is a play with friends spec. Unless you get the legendary daggers, I can't see myself putting this up here. But I think it's a play with friends spec. I think Subtlety just still doesn't do the things that Combat and Assassination can do. It's not really good on... Like, it has Fin and Knives just like the other two specs, but it doesn't have, like, a Blade Flurry, right? It can't really two-target cleave well. It doesn't have as strong AoE as Assassination because Assassination is leaning more into poisons and crit. So, it doesn't really do that well, right? Its Mastery is kind of meh, right? Even though, in my opinion, Main Gosh on Combat's kind of meh, but Main Gosh is still pretty good in single target. But Executioner, to me, is kind of whatever. It's still reliant on gear. And that's not really great when you're talking about early phase and waiting for gear in later phase. Now, if you, like I said, if you get the legendary daggers, you probably could do some numbers. Probably even bump up the Pug Champion solid. But that's because of a legendary. That's not really because Subtlety is good. So I would say Subtlety is reserved to the Play with Friends spec. Or Play with Friends tier. And the last DPS spec, I'll say. Not the lastly, but the last DPS spec. Unholy. Unholy, to me, goes... top of A tier, bottom of S tier. And I know I said I wouldn't tier individual like sets. I shouldn't say it like that, but if I'm doing this, I'll put Arms at the top. I'll do like that. I'll probably put that like right there. Fire and Shadow kind of interchangeable. I think Arms at the top. But I think Unholy has the damage ceiling to be better than a lot of these specs. And it's just really going to be dependent on the length of the fight and stuff like that. But a lot of specs and classes are like that. Like, right? Like performance is going to be based on execution of the fight, how fast you're killing the fight, so on and so forth. But Unholy, the reason why I said it would be, pardon me, either bottom of S tier or top of A tier is because Unholy is a little bit more difficult to play than Frost, and that can lead to Frost's favor. Like, complexity doesn't always breed better, right? If I'm playing a super simple rotation in Frost and I'm hitting my Pillar of Frost, at the optimal times and it's not being wasted and stuff like that, I could outperform an Unholy DK, right? And if this wasn't 4.3, because I think Frost got a slight nerf in like 4.2, Frost probably would be better than Unholy, right? Frost is, even though Unholy is not really gear dependent either, Frost is super not gear dependent. Right, you just get two weapons and keep it moving. Unholy kinda needs gear, but not as much as like Warrior or Rogue or anything like that. But I think its damage ceiling to me puts it in S tier. If you played Kata back in the day, you know the reference I'm about to make. Like if you get like Gurtalak in Dragon Soul. Gurtalak was a two-handed weapon that dropped off of the Madness of Deathwing, and it had a chance to summon tentacles that did Mind Flay, like the priest ability of Mind Flay. Mind Flay was shadow damage. Guess what type of damage the Unholy Mastery increases? Shadow damage. And that was kind of like not just for Unholy, but for Frost too. Like whenever you had outside sources and like that deal Frost did Unholy, that also got boosted by the Frost and Unholy Mastery, which was kind of crazy. And that happened for years. That change didn't get reverted to like recently. I don't think it was Dragonfly. I think it might have been either Shadowlands or BFA. One of the more recent expansions that got changed. But yeah, I think damage ceiling. I think Unholy definitely the potential goes in S tier. Unholy is also a spec that got a lot of changes. Number one, it got the Unholy Frenzy ability that was in the Blood Tree and Wrath got moved to the Unholy Tree, and they traded out what is it? Bone Shield, which isn't a big loss, right? Like trading out Bone Shield for a big haste cooldown really isn't. That's good on Holy's end, because now you can kind of line it up exactly with the the gargoyle. It's weird though that they made Unholy Frenzy still castable on other people, because there's no unholy DK in the world that's going to put Unholy Frenzy on someone else other than themselves, especially if Gargoyle's up with it. No way, no chance, right? So they got that change. Its Ghoul now has the Dark Transformation ability, which increases its damage done. Like, I know I keep referencing these talent trees, but I just want to make sure I can show the visuals. And of course, it's not here anymore. But yeah, its Ghoul got Dark Transformation, which I always love that ability. And I'm glad they leaned into it more in later expansions. So I'm going to put it up here. Whoop, there we go. Dark Transformation is right here. So basically, when you cast Death Coil, you get this thing called Shadow Infusion, right? And when you get 5 charges of Shadow Infusion, you can transform your Ghoul, making him do a lot. I think it's like 100% increased damage for 30 seconds. 30 seconds, number one, is a long time. That's a long time for a amp on your pet. And number 2, it empowered their abilities too. So not only did it get Unholy Frenzy, which is right here, it got a stronger Ghoul, and it still gets Gargoyle. Gargoyle's 3 minutes, Unholy Frenzy's 3 minutes. So its 3-minute damage profile is really, really powerful. So Unholy is really going to be a spec that lives or dies by probably fight duration, like fight length, how long it takes to kill something, and skill, because it's a little bit harder to play than Frost, in my opinion. But I think it belongs in S tier for a fact. All right, now it looks like we got a couple of the tanks remaining and the healer specs. So let's start with the healer. Let me take a drink of water real quick, because we already talked about tanks, that we didn't talk about healers at all. So first on the list is Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin, I think, easily goes in S tier. Holy Paladin, especially in the 4.3 patch, is just a different beast altogether. And I don't even think it's close, especially in terms of single target. Now we're gonna talk about another top contender too, and we're gonna compare them, but right now we're gonna stay on Holy Paladin for a second. So take this walk with me. So Holy Paladin, because of not only just the way Holy Paladin has worked just since TBC, but since the introduction of Holy Power, became incredibly mana efficient. Holy Paladins were already mana efficient, right? Don't get me wrong. And with the change of Spirit, so Spirit, the way Spirit works in Cataclysm is that Spirit is just good for all healers. Spirit isn't just good for instant cast boys or, people who have the meditation talent. Spirit is just the healer talent. Spirit will just give you a certain amount of mana when you're not casting and a certain amount of mana when you are casting. It's just good for all healers, right? So that's perfect, right? So now Holy Paladins can benefit from Spirit. They also got Holy Power, which for single target feeds into Word of Glory. Now, when you spend Holy Power on something, so in this case, let's say Word of Glory, you're not spending mana. Word of Glory heals for a metric. I don't want to curse on here, but it heals for a lot. And it costs no mana. And for Holy Paladins, it doesn't have a cooldown. So they're incredibly mana efficient, especially when they're tank healing, which there's a lot. This isn't Wrath. Like, Cat is a different beast when it comes to healing. Real quick TLDR, if you've never healed or never seen like old Kata videos or have friends who talked about the way healing works in Kata was a lot of burst damage. A lot of burst damage to the raid and a lot of burst damage to the tank. There was a lot of abilities that just did a lot of upfront damage, and if you're a healer, it was your job to deal with it. Point blank, period. Now, Holy Paladins were pretty equipped for that, but the landscape of healing for Kata was just burst, recover. A couple examples. I think I said this before in a different stream, but Nefarian's Crackle. If you, like, especially on Heroic, like, it did so much damage that it was damn near required to have a Hunter with Aspect of the Wild up or a Shaman with Nature Resist Totem up, because it did so much damage. And even with those abilities up, it still might kill somebody if they didn't have enough health. So you had to have healers recover that pretty quickly. Alakir, the second and the final boss at the same time in Throne of the Four Winds, not only did he do a lot of burst damage, he just did a lot of damage passively to the raid. And it wasn't like light damage either. It was just a lot of damage regardless. That was another fight. I'm trying to think. In Firelands, there was a lot of burst damage too. But the Firelands damage profile was a little bit different from the phase one because Firelands had a lot of like intermission style things. Like as an example, the spider boss Betalak. Like there was intermission phases where she would climb up at the top of the webs and she would rain down fire damage, and she was untargetable. There was a couple little ads out, but you had no choice but to just heal through this massive amounts of damage. Right, Ragnaros had a whole bunch of intermission phases where there was a lot of damage coming out that you just had to heal. Right, who else had a lot? Like you guys get the point. Like the landscape of healing was different, like in Cata, than most other expansions of WoW. So when you're looking at that and when you're facing that amount of burst damage, you kind of have to combat that. And there was no other healer, in my opinion. Like my opinion isn't the law, so you can feel free to disagree. But in my opinion, there was no other healer that was more well equipped dealing with burst tank damage and burst triage healing, or burst triage damage, I should say, than Paladin. Paladins had so many different effective cooldowns to deal with it. So we already talked about Holy Power. Like Word of Glory was just phenomenal. It didn't cost mana. It had no cooldown. And depending on the way you spec, there was a talent in the protection tree that had, if you maxed it out, had a 30% chance to make Word of Glory cost no Holy Power. So if you played the Gamba game, you could get a triple Holy Power and be fine, right? Holy Paladins also had Divine Favor, which reduced their mana cost by like 50%. Holy Paladins also, I'm trying to remember. Actually, I should just bring it up instead of working off memory. Y'all get the point. The Holy Paladin was cracked, is what I'm saying. Like, I'm saying it in so many words, but Holy Paladin was cracked. But I want to make sure I say the spells correctly, so you guys get the gist of it. But we talked about Divine Favor, which I'm sorry, Divine Favor didn't reduce your see, this is why I check things. Divine Favor increased your spell casting speed and your crit 3-minute cooldown. You still had Avenging Wrath, which is just a 20% healing increase, right? The new capstone talent to me was always lackluster. The Light of Dawn was basically like if you played SOD and you used Molten Burst as a shaman, like that conal fire damage. It basically was that. It was a conal heal ability that healed everybody within 12 yards of frontal cone of you, right? Now, Light of Dawn was always weak to me until 4.3, where it got some changes. Holy Paladins also got an ability called Holy Radiance that basically put a buff on someone and it radiated healing around that target, right? So you could cast it on yourself, you can cast it on the tank, you can cast it on the melee, you can cast it on anybody, and it would just radiate healing outward. And before, it was instant, but again, that was also one that was, in my opinion, pretty weak until they buffed it in 4.3. 4.3 was a really big Holy Paladin buff change. And Holy Paladins were already great, but we're going to talk about the other healer that was kind of eclipsing it and why it kind of warranted a buff. Pardon me. But Holy Paladins just got a lot of buffs on top of the incredible single target and triage healing that they could do. So now that we're going into Cataclysm Classic with all of the Holy Paladin buffs intact, I think Holy Paladin is an easy shoe-in for S tier healer. Easy shoe-in. Especially when you look at a lot of the problem abilities in phase 1, right? Like I said, Nefarian Crackle was a problem ability. I'm trying to think. The Omnitron defense system, even though that wasn't really a hard fight, it kind of could combo you. It was technically either the first or the second fight in Blackwing Descent, depending on which way you went. The Blackwing Descent TLDR, as soon as you zoned in, you can go left and fight Magma, or you can go right and fight Omnitron defense system. For the most part, most guilds went left and fought Magma because he was deemed as quote unquote the easier fight. And Omnitron was kind of a pug stomper, right? It like if you had people who didn't know, like whenever you face an encounter that has two bosses at once doing two different sets of abilities at once, that kind of is always a pug stomper. But Omnitron to me wasn't that hard. But Omnitron could slow you up. Of course, it had a lot of high profile fights like Maloriak. Maloriak was so annoying. But I'm going off on a tangent. But anyway, looking at the phase 1 landscape of healing and looking at the Paladin buffs that they get in 4.3, there's no way you couldn't put Holy Paladin in S tier. Now let's talk about the next healer that was giving the Paladin a run for his money that kind of warranted this buff, and that's Holy Priest. Holy Priest was rocking shit in Cataclysm. So Holy Priest, and this isn't a 4.3 thing. This is just like a Cata thing. So Holy Priest got chakras, which were kind of like stances in Cataclysm, and depending on which stance you're in, allowed you to do either single target or AoE healing. The problem is Holy Priest just did so much healing, just both passively, and I'll talk about why in a little bit, but it did so much healing passively. It did so much healing single target, and it did so much healing AoE, and it was effortless. Like, you really didn't have to think about it. It's kind of why Holy Priest kind of was just rocking things. Now, when it came to mastery, and I got to talk about Paladin mastery too, but let's talk about Holy Priest real quick. Holy Priest got the mastery Echo of Light, and basically whenever the priest healed you with anything, it left a hot on you. So it was basically a free hot for any heal that. So, and it didn't matter what heal that was. It could be renew, it could be heal, it could be flash heal, it could be circle of healing, it could be prayer. Like, when the Holy Priest healed you, you got a hot on you. And for the most part, like, especially if you weren't fighting challenging content, that hot kind of culminated into overhealing, right? Because if you're not really fighting difficult content, you didn't really need another hot. But in progression, when you needed it, not only was it a big mana saver, it was just a big raid stabilizer. And remember, we talked about the landscape of damage output or raid damage taken in Cata. It was a lot of burst, then recovery heal. And when you have a priest who's using Circle of Healing, healing 5 targets, and just not only putting out direct healing by virtue of Circle of Healing, but also just putting hots on people, in progression, that is a phenomenal trait to have. And for a long time, Holy Priests were just really, really powerful. On top of the fact that they have Lightwell, which was good now. Lightwell was decent. It didn't remove the like, if you got attacked, it didn't remove the hot, right? So Lightwell was pretty good. It still had a cheat death. Holy Priest was phenomenal in all profiles. Single target healing, triage healing, raid healing, massive AoE healing. Like, it was really, 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 really good. Really good. And it was pretty easy to play. And remember, like I said before with like the DKs, complexity doesn't always mean better. Sometimes the simpler spec will perform because you don't have to think about it. You can just perform. You can go. So Holy Priest was, on top of all that stuff, just easy to play. Going back to Holy Paladin for a minute, another thing that really made Holy Paladin strong was its mastery. So if you've been playing Holy Paladin recently, you know the mastery is kind of the distance thing, the Lightbringer thing. The closer you are to somebody, the more you heal. Back then in Cata, the mastery was in kind of the flip of Holy Priest. Whenever the Paladin healed you, it left a small absorb on you, a small absorb shield. And the scale rate for Holy Paladin mastery was kind of on the low side. That didn't change the strength of it, especially when you factor into abilities like Eternal Flame. Eternal Flame was so strong. Hold on, let me bring it up real quick. Eternal Flame basically was a hot that Holy Paladins had. And what it did was, I'm bringing up the tooltip so I can read it here. Oh, actually, Eternal Flame was in Mob. I'm bugging. But the illuminated healing, the mastery that Holy Paladins got, that was really, really strong. One thing that made it super strong, even though I didn't really see too many Paladins doing this, but you'll probably see this like when you look at logs and stuff like this. One thing a Holy Paladin could do, if not for everybody, because it was kind of hard for the Holy Paladin to do this, but it definitely could do this on the tank, was before you start a fight, what a Holy Paladin could do was, like, before you get into combat, you could just heal the tank and kind of pre-shield them, kind of like the same thing that a Disc Priest does when they put up powered shield before combat starts. You could heal the Holy Paladin with Holy Light, Flashlight, whatever you want to call it, and stack up the illuminated healing shield, because you didn't actually have to heal the target to get the shield. A portion of the healing, whatever the healing would be, just went on the target. And just like with free hots, free absorbs is definitely good. So that also kind of played into why Holy Paladins were really strong. But like I said, Holy Paladins and Holy Priests were kind of two sides of the same coin. Prior to 4.3, I would have said Holy Priest was the better healer. But because Holy Paladin got so many buffs in 4.3, I think they're on even terms now. Next. Sorry, so we did a couple healers. Let's do the tanks. Let's go back to tanking. Let's talk Protection Paladin, and I would say Protection Paladin is probably goes to the solid tier, and I'll talk about it why. So, coming from Wrath, a large strength of not just protection but just Paladins as a whole, a large strength that the Paladins had was they could pretty much any spec could pretty much spec into Divine Sacrifice, right, and give the raid a really powerful, or at the very least, the party a really powerful defensive, right. Same thing with Aura Mastery, right. Aura Mastery was another one where, at least for Ret could spec into it. I don't know if Proc could, but Ret could pretty easily spec into Aura Mastery and not lose too much, right? And that was kind of really good in Paladin, where you could play your main spec and still bring the utility of the main, or one of the main cooldowns of the other talent trees. You can't really do that in Cataclysm. Number one, Aura Mastery and Divine Sacrifice are way too far into their respective trees to be taken by any other spec. So if you're Ret, you didn't have enough talent points to spec far enough into the protection tree to get Divine Sacrifice. Number two, you had to spend, I think, 31 points at least in your respective tree, whatever specialization you picked. So in this case, we're talking about Prot. You had to spend 31 points into the Prot tree before you could even go into another talent tree. And a lot of people didn't like this because one thing that they liked coming off of Wrath was the flexibility and being able to change your spec. Like there was no two paladins were the same spec, right? Like if you're a Prot Paladin, you might have had some points in Ret. Some Prot Paladins might have had some points in Holy to get Aura Mastery. Whereas in Kata, pretty much every single Paladin is running the same build because of that talent point requirement. And some people didn't like that. I mean, I'm indifferent about it. I don't really care. But going back to Paladin's strengths and weaknesses, when it comes to their strength, I think with the talent changes, it was a gift and a curse because they got some really powerful talents, right? And they got some talents to move up early in the tree. Like I think Grand Crusader is an amazing talent. I love that talent. That's the talent where you have a chance to proc your Avenger Shield. I love that talent, right? I think the change to Ardent Defender, making it an active cooldown ability instead of just kind of a weak passive, to me, in my opinion, was not weak because it's still a cheat death, but making it an active ability, to me, is the better play. I always praise active abilities because I can use it right at the moment that I need it the most. Whereas with the old Ardent Defender or the Wrath version of Ardent Defender, you kind of had to die for it to proc, right? Whereas you being able to turn on and off a cheat death when you want, to me, is better than, boy, I hope this procs when I need it to. So I like the change in Ardent Defender. I like the introduction of Grand Crusader. For Divine Guardian, I think this is a nerf in my opinion. Well, it's not even an opinion. I think this is just a straight up nerf. So in Wrath, Divine Guardian also allows the Paladin to take 20% reduced damage. In Kata, that's not the case. You just reduce the damage that everyone else takes, which is a nerf. Obviously, you can't use it as a personal anymore, so that's kind of a meh thing. You can no longer get Aura Master, as we spoke about, as Prot, so that's kind of a thing. And when it comes to its offensive abilities, actually, no, there's one more defensive. Guardian of the Ancient Kings. So Guardian of the Ancient Kings is a new ability that Prot get. It's a 5-minute cooldown, but it's a big wall ability. It reduces your damage you take by 50%, right? It's a big ability. Outside of that cooldown, I think Prot Paladin's defenses, even with Ardent Defender, are kind of lackluster because they're very one dimensional, right? So the outside of Guardian of the Ancient Kings, you have Ardent Defender, which is a 3 minute cooldown, which is a cheat death and a 20% DR, and then you have Divine Protection, which is just a 1 minute cooldown with just a 20% DR. But there's a glyph that you can use to change it. It only does physical damage, but you can change it to magic damage, so you can kind of make it like a mini AMS, right? And with that being said, just by circulating those 3 abilities, it kind of puts Paladin on the back burner in terms of cooldown versatility. Because, as an example, if you compare it to Blood DK has Icebound Fortitude, which is a 50% DR on the 2 minute cooldown. So already better than Guardian of the Ancient Kings, which is their best ability, right? They have Anti-Magic Shell, which we all know the strength of Anti-Magic Shell, right? They have Vampiric Blood, right? Which, in my opinion, is better than Divine Protection. It's better than the 20% DR because it increases it's basically Last Standing and Guardian Spirit in the same button without the cheat death tied to it, right? They have Dancing Rune Weapon now, which is a really, really good avoidance style cooldown. So when you're comparing Blood to Prot, it's like defensively it's just not adding up. Prot has good defensives, and Prot still brings my updates are going off. But anyway, Prot has good defensives, and Prot still brings Divine Guardian, and it's a Paladin. It's going to bring buffs, but just bringing buffs is not good enough anymore. Just bringing Divine Guardian isn't good anymore because all of these classes, there's a multitude of classes that are bringing raid-wide stuff, right? So that's it on the defensive side. On the offensive side, I mean, outside of Avenging Wrath, Paladin really, it's weird because Paladin came off of Wrath of the Lich King, the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, doing a lot of damage. But it kind of it doesn't really have that in Cataclysm. I think Druid does way more damage than Guardian. Than Protection Paladin. I think Protection is still a solid tank, and there's no real bad tanks in my opinion. I think Protection is a real solid tank. It doesn't particularly need a lot of gear. It still has serviceable cooldowns. It still has pretty good utility. It still can, if you're tank swapping and your co-tank is tanking, you can still kind of feed healing into it with free Word of Glories. You can still do some things that other tanks can't do pretty easily. But I don't think defensively, I just don't think it's even a comparison between the other 2 tanks that we already have tiered up. So I would just keep Paladin in solid. I think it's better than PugChamp, but I don't know if I put it up here yet. And I'll just finish out the last thing. Protection Warrior. So Protection Warrior to me is another slept on spec. And I think that's probably in large part because of how it was in Wrath, right? Wrath, it was kind of like the redheaded stepchild when it came to both offense and defense. I think it got its shine in phase 1 because it was definitely the dominant speed clear tank. I think it got its shine in the TLC phase because it was the block tank, so it was able to reduce a lot of damage by those adds. But it was still, in my opinion, for the majority of Wrath, just considered the lackluster tank. So some of that kind of spills over into Kata, even though I think that's just a mindset, and I think Protection Warrior gets a lot of good changes, especially in its talents that get overlooked. Its mastery is really, really strong. I think Critical Block is a really, really strong mastery, and it's something that they still have till this day. Being able to, so real quick, just about blocking. There's no more block value in Cataclysm, if you don't know. Block value is gone. Whenever one of the shield tanks blocks something, it just reduces the damage that it would take by 30%. So it's just a 30% flat DR when you block something. Warriors can critically block, which means that 30% goes to 60%. And their mastery increases, I think that I don't think it increases the amount, but it increases the chance that you critically block. I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure it increases the not the amount, but the chance. But critically blocking is definitely one of the highlights of Warrior. Let me go to the mastery real quick so I can see, just so I make sure I'm saying the right thing. Yeah, it increases your chance. It doesn't increase the amount. So critical blocks is just always 60%, but your mastery increases the how often you do it, which is still pretty good because 60% reduction on auto attacks, which is pretty much the bulk of. I hear offspring. Hey, buddy. Okay, come here. 60% is a lot, especially when you're considering the bulk of tank damage is just auto attacks. So yeah, the mastery department for a warrior is still pretty good. Um, where I think warriors falter is almost similarly in the same vein as where the paladin kind of falters is cooldowns. It still has pretty good cooldowns. It has last stand. It has shield wall. Right. It has enrage regeneration, but those are still really one-dimensional cooldowns, and I don't even think enrage regen is super strong. Like it's definitely not strong in the last stand. It's definitely not strong in like a vamp blood or a bark skin or something like that. So I think in the cooldown department it kind of falters, and I think prot kind of falls into the similar situation where the other warrior specs kind of fall into, where it's like it's kind of squishy early on. It's pretty gear dependent, but I think that all changes when you get gear. Prot is pretty solid. Like I'll give you an example. Like when I was playing Kata originally, when it first came out, we had a prot warrior for all our progression things, and he did phenomenal. He was a phenomenal tank. So I think that just plays more into the mindset of you can really play with anything as long as the pilot, the person who's actually playing, is good. So as far as tiering is concerned, I'd probably put Prot as Pug Champ, but it can be solid. But it probably should be Pug Champ. But I'm going to just put myself at be right back, take care of the offspring, and we'll finish up the last three. Okay. Sorry about that. Children, children, children. Okay. So we have the final three healers here. I'll try to be quick because I definitely did a tank healer one, so I don't know if my views have changed or not. They probably have since my last stream. But anyway, let's do Disc Priest. So Disc Priest is still strong, right? And kept going into Cataclysm. And Disc Priest still has one of, if not the strongest raid CDs in Powered Barrier. And because, not just in phase one, Kata has a lot of opportunities to make use of Powered Barrier, only further strengthens the Disc Priest. Besides the fact that Disc Priest is really the only healer that does absorbs, like just flat reduces the raid damage taken, which is a super strength in and of itself. It just makes Disc Priest that much stronger. Now, I will say something that's going against Disc Priest is that it's a little harder to snipe heals from the other healers just because of the way damage comes out in Cataclysm. There's so much damage that it's not just like, it's like in Wrath, right, where the damage profiles were so low, especially like across raids, where it's like the Disc Priest was really the only one who was having fun. He would put absorbs on people, who put absorbs on the tank, and that person is instantly taking half the damage that they normally would have, which means there's less to heal, which means the other healers are kind of struggling to figure out what they're really doing, right? In Kata, the damage levels are higher, so even while the Disc Priest is still putting out absorbs through Powered Shield and Divine Aegis and stuff like that, that's not really just cutting it anymore. Like, now there still needs to be healing done, or there's going to be a follow-up mechanic that's still going to do damage, right? So the Disc Priest, while still really, really strong, definitely still needs to be supported by the other healers. And I think that's where the Disc Priest's weakness is showcased a little bit more, because Disc Priest isn't really the greatest throughput healer. So if there's a lot of raid damage going out, I'm trying to think of a fight where there's just a lot of raid damage. Sinestra. Sinestra just has a passive aura that just does a lot of damage to the raid. Disc Priest can absorb all that stuff, that's fine, but absorbs isn't healing. And because of Weakened Soul, you start to see the cracks in the tough Disc Priest armor where it needs to be supplemented by something else. So I think, especially in progression where damage is really high and gear levels are low. So Disc Priest, to me, is still super solid. I can even put it in Platinum because Powered Barrier is really good. So good, in fact, that some guilds were just ignoring mechanics because of it. But I think it needs to be supplemented by its other healers, more so than what we saw in Wrath. Well, I would put the bottom of A tier, definitely top of solid tier, something like that. Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman is kind of on the opposite end of the Disc Priest, where it has a niche that when it's filled, it's the best healer, but unless that niche is filled, it kind of falters a bit. Resto Shaman's it's two niches. Number one, it's stacked healing. They get Healing Rain in Cataclysm, and that boasts a lot of stacked healing. Now, just like with Powered Barrier, there's a lot of opportunities for shamans to make use of Healing Rain, especially in bigger raid sizes in 25-man. Like, if your raid is a 10-man, maybe not so much. Like Healing is still strong, but you get what I'm saying. But there's a lot of opportunities to use Healing Rain, and the Shaman Mastery is deep healing. And basically, the way it works is the lower the target's health is, the more the Shaman's healing spells will heal. And Kata, we spoke about it all this whole stream, is an expansion where there's going to be a lot of points where there's going to be people with low health, right? Especially in farm content. So Shamans are really going to be the MVPs when things are being, not farm content, on prog content, that's what I meant. So Shamans are going to be the MVP when it comes to prog. But then you start to see things slow down for Shamans when things become farm, when fights are lasting a little bit short. I mean, that's all healer thing, but when fights are lasting shorter, people are taking less damage, you kind of see that, right? But Shamans also boast a very, very powerful cooldown in Spirit Link Totem. Spirit Link Totem is a totem that when placed down, it reduces all damage taken by 10% when you stand in it, right? But it also redistributes health repeatedly for the duration. I think it lasts like 10 or 15 seconds. So as an example, if, let's say in a 25-man, let's say 10 people are at full health, but 15 people are at half health, and Spirit Link Totem is dropped on them. It will redistribute the health to make everybody's health even, and it will consistently do that as damage is going out. So it's basically free AoE healing without actually having to heal, on top of the obviously strong stacked healing that a shaman can do with Healing Rain and Chain Heal. So Spirit Link Totem is a really powerful, a very, very powerful cooldown, just like Barrier, right? And in prog content, I think a shaman is very powerful. Like I said before, their weakness is really they need stacked healing, and when you have to spread out, that's a shaman's weakness. They don't have a super solid external, right? They don't have a guardian spirit. They don't have pain suppression. So that their single target healing kind of falters. Even though they do have tidal waves, to me, tidal waves didn't really become good until later expansions. But their single target healing can kind of be kind of mad. They would really just rather cast Chain Heal. And if Chain Heal bounces overheal, then it's kind of a waste. So you get what I'm trying to say. But they're still shamans. They still bring a lot of utility. Again, they have Spirit Link Totem. They have Mana Tide Totem, so they can help other healers recover. They have healing. Do they have Healing Tide Totem? I don't know if they have Healing Tide Totem. I'm going to bring that back. I don't think that was a Cata thing. But they still have Spirit Link and they have Mana Tide. So I'd have to check to see if they had Healing Tide Totem. Let's see. Is it in the database? No, it is not. Healing Tide Totem is not a Cata thing. So there you have it. But for shaman healing, you know, if I'm going to put, I can't put disc here if I'm going to put shaman. I'm going to put disc up here. I'm going to put disc here, and I'll put shamans. Probably here, probably in the PugChamp category, because a good shaman healer is going to carry the heals in a pug if the other healer is lackluster. Easily. A good shaman healer is just going to, like, especially in like 10-man where like you can just maximize Chain Heal. Like a good shaman healer is definitely just going to carry the wave in a PugChamp. So it's also pretty solid in higher amounts and progression. The thing though is, like, if you're going to bring a shaman, you're probably bringing it for one of its totem buffs, not really for, or it's just deep healing progression. But once prog is over, the power kind of goes down a little bit. So that's a problem with shaman. Like, and it's not just a matter of, oh, we're killing fights faster, there's nothing to heal. No, it's like if people are taking less damage, that's a detriment to the way deep healing works, the mastery works. So I'll probably put shaman in PugChamp, but I'm not mad if somebody says, no, Soul, you're wrong. Put it in solid or put it in higher. And lastly, we have the Resto Druid, my favorite healer spec. So Resto Druid in Cataclysm got a lot of changes. I think the most famous one, or infamous one, depending on how you feel about it, is the change to tree form. So tree form is no longer a passive form that you just have at all times. It is a cooldown. It's a 3-minute cooldown that enhances your armor and your spells by a lot. And when this came out, I remember the tears that people cried about tree form. They were so attached to the treant form that it was a disgrace. I personally didn't have those feelings about Resto Druid. When tree form came out, to me, a supercharged up heal form, to me, it kind of reminded me of like a druid having Avenging Wrath, right? A real throughput cooldown button that I could use, right? So that's the way I kind of looked at new tree form. So they got tree form. They also got a change to Tranquility. Tranquility now works the same way as Divine Hymn, where it doesn't just heal the party. It's a smart heal for the raid. That was a really, really big change for Druid, because notoriously Tranquility wasn't really a good spell. It cost a lot of mana. It only healed the party, and if you weren't in the right party, it wasn't good, and it could just lead to a lot of overhealing. It really wasn't a good button to press. But now it's a really good button to press. Druids also got the first incarnation of Efflorescence, which is the big green circle you might see on, like, if you play Dragonflight or you've seen a lot of videos. They got that, which just helped their stacked healing, because Druids were really always masters at AoE healing, obviously because of the way their spells work with rejuvenation and wild growth and stuff like that. So they were really, really strong AoE and spread out healers, but didn't really have a profile when it came to like stacked healing or group AoE. But now with Efflo, it kind of softened the blow a little bit. 1 second. So they did get that. Other than that, I think Druid is just always solid, because whenever you have a healer that's always able to do consistent and efficient healing, Druid is one of the most efficient healers in Cataclysm. They really don't have too many mana problems unless they're overspending. Like, you have to overspend to have mana issues as a druid, and it's really hard to do it unless you're just always trying to, like, and especially on the 25 man, if you're just always trying to fully blanket everybody in Rejuve, that can get mana, that can become mana costly. If you're using Wild Growth on CD, that was one that kind of rubbed people the wrong way too. That changed that. Wild Growth getting a CD. Wild Growth was it's still instant in Wrath, but it didn't have a CD, whereas Wild Growth got a CD in Cata, which I think honestly it was warranted because you couldn't have the changes that Druid got in Cata and have Wild Growth just operating free. It's like Circle of Healing not having a CD. Like if they went back to that, like that would be kind of nutty. If the way Holy Feast works in Cata, not having a Circle of Healing CD. So, and it's not even a long CD. It's like a 6 or 8 second CD. But I do remember Circle of Healing, not Circle of Healing, Wild Growth having a CD definitely rubbed people the wrong way, completely. But that's definitely a nerf in my opinion. I get it. It was a necessary nerf, but it was still a nerf regardless. So, but I don't think that nerf eclipsed the great things about Arresto Druid. It was still an efficient healer. It still had a really powerful cooldown in tree form. It had a nice raid wide ability in Tranquility. It was one of the best Dark Intent users, Dark Intent being the haste buff that Warlocks give out. So it was basically always able to keep up max stacks of Dark Intent on Warlocks. And Warlocks, especially if you had a Demo, being one of the best DPS, is going to increase your raid DPS. So Resto Druid had a lot going for it. In terms of the 4.3 changes, I don't think anything was really, I think it was more so a Guardian change versus a Druid change. They did get a big nerf in 4.3. Wild Growth healing got reduced by 20%, which is a really, really big nerf. And yeah, when you have, I won't say Wild Growth is their bread and butter, but it's their go-to AoE heal. When your go-to AoE heal gets nerfed by 20%, that never feels good. So that definitely will play into an effect with Resto Druid, but I think Resto goes into the solid section. I don't think it's the best healer, and if you don't have one, I don't think it's, make it or break it. Even though I think it's nice to have one, because it's always nice to have about another battle res. It's always nice to have just passive healing when things are just AoEing you to death, especially when you need fast recovery. It's nothing like having a Resto Druid like pre-hot everybody and then hit Wild Growth when a big AoE comes out. So I think Resto Druid is like, it's noticeable, but it's not. It's like a nice to have, not a need to have. And I think Resto Druid goes in the solid tier. Definitely goes in solid. All right, so that's all the classes. Now we just look at all the tiers, and based on everything what I said, I think I'm comfortable with the placements of everything. I think there's an argument that you can make for Demonology to be S tier, but I think it'll be hard pressed. It'd be hard pressed for a Demonology to, at a high level, I think it'd be hard pressed for a Demonology to compete with the other casters in this tier, namely Fire Mage and Shadow Priest. And that's just because, number one, meta is on a 3-minute cooldown, right? Whereas Shadow Priests don't really have a cooldown on their Shadow Orbs, right? They don't have a cooldown on there. Combustion is a cooldown, but it can critically hit, and Fire really doesn't live or die by Combustion. Whereas Demo kinda lives by its meta windows, and these other casters don't have DPS windows that they live or die by. So that's one thing. I'll say maybe when you get to execute phase, meta can become closer because Demo has a strong execute, but I'm hard pressed to keep this in S tier. There's an argument for it, but I think I'd keep it in A tier. Another one is Ret. Ret, I think, can be arguably A tier because I think it has the tools and the toolkit to compete with the rest of the A tier classes, like the A tier melee, but it's on a contingency, right? Especially when you add more targets into the mix. So, as an example, I'm trying to think. Let's say Magma. Let's use Magma, the first boss in Blackwing Descent. On heroic, he summons these big skeleton ad that needs to die. A Frosty K can 2-target cleave that no problem. Howling Blast already hits. You can spread your disease to it. So it's no problem for a Frosty Kid to cleave that pup. The Red Paladin is not going to use Divine Storm on it, and if he is, he's going to just be wasting Holy Power. Because he's not, or wasting Ukuna because he's not going to be generating Holy Power. So it's going to shorten his Holy Power generation. So there's an argument for Ret to be in the S tier because I think when the terms fit Ret Paladin, it can do S tier style damage. Or A tier style damage, but there's just contingencies for it. So I think it puts in solid. It could be top of solid. I'll say that. It could be top of solid. Because I think it does more damage than the rest of the damage specs in here. Maybe you move Arcane up a little bit because Arcane does pump. But I think it can be top of its own tier, but it's hard for me to put it here. And you know what? While I'm at it, let me just do this. Let me do the tiers in regards to performance. So I'm okay with Arms being top here. I would move Shadow. Would I move Shadow over Survival? I think I would. I think I would move Shadow over Survival. Even though I think these three perform pretty equally. Fire might get the better on shorter fights because the Shadow Priest still has to generate the orbs. Fire can kind of go off. I mean, it still lives and dies by hot streak crits, but still, I think shorter fights might lean more towards the Fire Mage. Longer fights are going to lean towards the Shadow Priest and the Survival. I think Arms doesn't matter. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about it doesn't care whether the fight is long or short. It does good burst. It does good sustain. It does good AoE. It doesn't care. A tier platinum, no features. I would say because it doesn't need as much deep gear, I would say you probably can put Frost over Assassin, even though I'm not mad if you put that over there. I think Boomkin is, I think that is better. That is probably better. I'm fine with this. Pug champs are just pug champs, and then there's that. So there you have it. And I think that is it. I think all of you guys, if you guys stuck it with me from the beginning, I appreciate it. If you joined in the middle and you caught up, I appreciate it. If you catch this on the watch back, I appreciate it. Thank you for sitting and taking this walk with me as we tiered every single spec in Cataclysm. And let me know what y'all think. If y'all think I was dead ass wrong on some of these, put it in the comments. If you think I got everything pretty okay, put it in the comments. If you would move certain things up or down, let me know in the comments below. Other than that, y'all been great. I've been Soul, and I'm out. Peace. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like it. Sheesh. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.